When Caleb Hart ordered a plain, practical wife through a matrimonial agency, he expected someone who'd blend into the harsh Montana landscape like dust on leather. What stepped off that February stagecoach was a woman so striking, so utterly refined, that his first thought wasn't gratitude, it was dread. Because women like Eleanor Whitlock didn't choose men like him. They didn't choose lives like this. And whatever terrible mistake had brought her to his frozen corner of hell, he knew with bone-deep certainty it would end in heartbreak, most likely his. If you're ready to discover whether two wounded souls can forge something stronger than survival in the unforgiving frontier, stay with this story until the very end. And please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see just how far Eleanor and Caleb's journey travels across this beautiful world. The wind off the mountains carried ice in its teeth. Caleb Hart stood on the platform of the Helena Depot with his hat pulled low and his collar turned up against the February cold, watching his breath cloud white in the thin afternoon light. Around him, the small crowd shifted and murmured, ranch hands meeting supply wagons, families greeting relatives, the usual commerce of a frontier town on a Thursday. But Caleb wasn't watching them. His eyes were fixed on the stagecoach that had just rounded the bend, its wheels cutting dark lines through the snow-packed road. Inside that coach was his future, a practical arrangement, a solution to a problem. Nothing more. He'd been alone on the ranch for 3 years now, ever since his wife Sarah had died, bringing their stillborn son into a world that seemed determined to take more than it gave. 3 years of silence broken only by cattle and wind. 3 years of cooking his own meals, mending his own clothes, talking to horses because there was no one else. He'd managed. He was good at managing. But management wasn't the same as living, and somewhere in the long darkness of the previous winter, he'd admitted what he'd been avoiding. The ranch needed a woman's hand, and he needed something, someone, a presence that wasn't grief. So he'd done what practical men did on the frontier. He'd written to a matrimonial agency in Chicago. He'd been specific in his requirements. A woman of plain appearance and strong constitution, accustomed to hard work, expecting nothing beyond room, board, and respect. No romantic notions, no false promises, just honest labor and honest partnership. The agency had written back with a match. Miss Eleanor Whitlock, age 28, experienced in household management, seeking a fresh start in the territories, available immediately. The description had been spare, almost clinical, which suited Caleb fine. He wasn't looking for poetry. He was looking for someone who could survive a Montana winter and not complain about the isolation. The stagecoach pulled to a stop with a spray of slush, and the driver shouted command. Caleb straightened, pushing away from the post he'd been leaning against. His hands, he noticed, were clenched inside his gloves. He forced them to relax. The door opened. A gentleman in a wool coat stepped down first, turning to assist the passengers still inside. A woman's gloved hand appeared, accepting his help. Then a boot, practical, leather, well-made but not fancy. Good, Caleb thought. She's sensible, at least. But then the rest of her emerged, and every thought in Caleb's head went silent. The woman who stepped onto the platform wasn't plain. She wasn't practical looking. She was... Caleb didn't have words for what she was. Tall, for a woman, nearly his own height. Dark hair swept back in an elegant style that probably had a name he didn't know. Features that weren't classically beautiful, but were striking in a way that made you look twice, then a third time. And the way she carried herself, spine straight, chin level, movements precise and controlled, spoke of finishing schools and ballrooms, not frontier ranches and cattle drives. She wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy wool, tailored to fit her frame with the kind of craftsmanship that cost real money. Her gloves were kid leather. Her boots, though practical, were clearly expensive. Even her posture radiated a kind of refinement that seemed completely incongruous with the rough wooden platform and the smell of horse manure and coal smoke. This couldn't be her. There'd been a mistake. Caleb started forward anyway because the coach was already pulling away and she was standing there alone, one hand on a carpet bag, the other shading her eyes as she scanned the platform, looking for someone. Looking, he realized with a sinking sensation, for him. Their eyes met across 30 feet of snow-dusted boards. Something flickered in her expression, assessment, perhaps, or recognition. She didn't smile. Neither did he. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers about to become something else entirely, both clearly wondering what the hell they'd gotten themselves into. Caleb closed the distance, aware of every eye on the platform following his movement. Small towns had long memories and hungry gossip mills. By tomorrow, everyone in Helena would know that Caleb Hart's mail-order bride looked like she'd stepped out of a San Francisco drawing room. He stopped 3 feet away and removed his hat. Miss Whitlock? Her eyes were gray, clear and direct and unsettling in their intelligence. Mr. Hart. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered in a voice that was low and composed and carried the faintest accent he couldn't quite place. East Coast, probably. Money and education in every syllable. There's been a mistake, he said. One dark eyebrow rose. I don't believe so. You wrote to the Westward Matrimonial Agency requesting a bride. I responded. They arranged our correspondence and this meeting, unless you're not Caleb Hart, owner of the Hart Ranch outside Helena? I am, but then there's no mistake. She set down her carpet bag and drew a folded paper from her reticule. I have the contract here, if you'd like to review it. Caleb stared at the paper, then at her. Ma'am, I asked for someone plain, someone practical. And I, she said quietly, asked for someone honest. Someone who wouldn't make promises he couldn't keep. Her gaze held his. The agency said you were direct in your requirements, that you wanted a working partnership, not a romance, that you had no interest in appearance or refinement, only capability. Is any of that untrue? No, but then I'm exactly what you asked for. She picked up her bag again. I can work hard, Mr. Hart. I can manage a household, tend animals, cook, clean, mend, and do whatever else is required. What I look like shouldn't matter, if those were truly your only concerns. She was right. And Caleb hated that she was right, because it meant he'd have to acknowledge the real reason he was standing here like an idiot arguing with a woman he'd agreed to marry. He was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to have someone like her in his house. Afraid of the expectations that would come with that refined bearing and those intelligent eyes. Afraid most of all that she would look at his rough hands and rougher life and realize she'd made a terrible mistake. And he'd have to watch her regret settling in day by day until it became unbearable for both of them. You don't belong here, he said finally, and hated how harsh it came out. Something flashed in her eyes. Not anger. Something deeper. Neither do you, apparently, if you're this determined to send away someone you asked for. That's not what Mr. Hart. She shifted the bag to her other hand. Her composure never wavered, but he could see tension in the set of her shoulders now. I've traveled 1,800 miles to be here. I've left behind everything I knew. I have nowhere else to go and no interest in going back. The contract states we'll have a trial period of 3 months, after which either of us can dissolve the arrangement if it's not satisfactory. That seems more than fair. But if you're going to send me away, please do it now rather than waste both our time. The platform had gone quiet around them. Caleb could feel the weight of attention, the listening ears. This was exactly the kind of scene that would fuel talk for months. He looked at Eleanor Whitlock, really looked at her. Past the refined exterior and the expensive clothes and the bearing that spoke of a completely different world, what he saw in her eyes wasn't arrogance or false expectations. It was determination, and underneath that, something that looked a lot like desperation held firmly in check. She was running from something, just like him. The realization settled something in his chest. Maybe they were a mistake. Maybe this whole arrangement was doomed from the start. But she'd come all this way, and she was asking for 3 months. 3 months wasn't forever. 3 months he could manage. The ranch is 2 hours from town, he said. The house is small and the work is hard. Winters are brutal. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. You'll be isolated most of the time. I understand. I'm not easy company. I don't talk much. I expect competence and I don't tolerate complaints. I wouldn't dream of complaining, Mr. Hart. He studied her a moment longer, looking for any sign of uncertainty. Found none. All right then. 3 months. We'll see how it goes. Relief flickered across her features. So brief he almost missed it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He gestured toward the end of the platform where his wagon waited. Let's get your things loaded. Storm's coming in tonight. She had one trunk and the carpet bag. Not much for a woman starting a new life. Caleb hoisted the trunk onto his shoulder, heavier than it looked, and led the way to the wagon. Eleanor followed without comment, her steps sure on the icy boards. The wagon was functional, not fancy. 2 sturdy horses in harness, a flatbed with sides built up for hauling supplies. Caleb had thrown some blankets in the back and brought his warmest buffalo robe for the ride. He secured the trunk, then turned to help Eleanor up. She was already climbing into the seat, managing her skirts with practiced efficiency. Of course she was. Caleb swung up beside her, took the reins, and released the brake. The horses leaned into their collars and the wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching on packed snow. For the first 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. Helena fell away behind them, the buildings thinning out until there was nothing but snow-covered prairie stretching toward mountains that looked like they'd been carved from stone and ice. The road, such as it was, wound through low hills dotted with scrub pine and bare cottonwoods. The sky overhead was the color of old iron, heavy with the promise of snow. Caleb kept his attention on the horses and the road, but he was acutely aware of the woman beside him. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect despite the wagon's jolting. She didn't ask questions or make observations about the landscape, just watched the miles unfold with that same composed expression. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, because the silence was starting to feel pointed. "No," she agreed. "I imagine not. The agency said you were experienced in household management." "I am." "Where?" A pause. "Philadelphia. I managed my father's household for 10 years after my mother passed." That explained the accent and the refinement. "Big household?" 12 rooms, 3 servants, frequent entertaining. Caleb's house had 4 rooms and no servants. He was starting to understand the magnitude of the adjustment she'd be making. "And you're willing to trade that for a Montana ranch in the middle of nowhere?" "Willing?" She turned to look at him then, and there was something sharp in her gray eyes. "Mr. Hart, I'm desperate for it." The honesty caught him off guard. "Why?" She looked away, back toward the mountains. "For the same reason you wrote to a matrimonial agency, I imagine. Because the life I had became unbearable, and this seemed like the only way to escape it." Fair enough. Caleb wasn't inclined to press for details when he had no intention of sharing his own. "The work will be different from what you're used to." "I'm aware. I mean completely different. There's no calling for servants when something needs doing. If a meal needs cooking, you cook it. If water needs hauling, you haul it. If the chickens need feeding, or the garden needs weeding, or the washing needs doing, it's all you, every day. No breaks, no one to delegate to." "I understand, Mr. Hart." "Do you?" He couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. "Because managing servants and actually doing the work yourself are 2 very different things." She turned to face him again, and this time there was steel in her expression. "I spent 10 years running a household where my father believed women existed solely to maintain appearances and facilitate his comfort. I planned menus, managed accounts, supervised staff, hosted dinners, and smiled pleasantly while being told my only value was in how well I could ornament his table. I am fully aware of the difference between delegation and labor, and I vastly prefer the latter. At least when I do the work myself, I can take pride in the result." Caleb blinked. That was the most he'd heard her say at once, and there was real feeling behind it. Anger, maybe, or bitterness long held. "Fair point," he said after a moment. Her expression softened fractionally. "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Hart. I'm afraid of other things. But never work." He wanted to ask what she was afraid of, but they'd already strayed further into personal territory than he'd intended. Better to keep things practical. "The house isn't much. 4 rooms, kitchen, parlor, 2 bedrooms, no indoor plumbing. Well, it's 30 yards from the back door. Outhouse is another 20 beyond that. Many frontier homes have the same arrangement. Heat comes from the kitchen stove and a fireplace in the parlor. You have to keep both going or the place gets cold fast. The bedrooms don't have heat at all. I'll manage. Nearest town is Helena, but I only go in once a month for supplies unless there's an emergency. Rest of the time, we're on our own. I understand isolation, Mr. Hart. I'm not afraid of silence." She kept saying she understood, but Caleb wondered if she really did. Understanding something in theory was different from living it day after day. He'd seen plenty of women come west with stars in their eyes, only to break under the relentless grind of frontier life. And Eleanor, for all her claimed capability, still carried herself like someone who'd never gone a day without the comforts civilization provided. But that wasn't his problem. Not yet, anyway. She wanted 3 months to prove herself. He'd give her 3 months. If she couldn't handle it, she'd leave. If she could, well, he'd deal with that when it happened. The road climbed through a narrow pass between two hills, and suddenly the ranch was visible below them. 600 acres of snow-covered land hemmed in by mountains on 3 sides. The house sat in the center, a squat timber structure that looked small and dark against all that white expanse. Beyond it were the barn, the stable, a chicken coop, and a scatter of corrals and outbuildings. Smoke rose from the house's chimney, barely visible against the gray sky. It wasn't much. Caleb knew that. Compared to what Eleanor had described, 12 rooms, servants, entertaining, it must look like a hovel. He watched her face as she took it in, waiting for the disappointment, the regret. What he saw instead was something that looked almost like relief. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Caleb followed her gaze, trying to see what she was seeing. The house was weathered and plain. The outbuildings needed paint. The whole place had the worn, functional look of something built to endure rather than impress. "It's isolated," he corrected. "Yes." She smiled then, just a small curve of her mouth, but it transformed her face completely, made her look younger, less guarded. "Exactly." The wagon rolled down the slope toward the house. The horses knew they were close to warmth and food. Their pace quickened without prompting. Caleb let them have their heads, his mind working through the logistics of the next few hours. Get Eleanor settled, show her the house, go over basic expectations, keep everything practical and clear. He pulled the wagon up to the front door and set the brake. "I'll get your trunk. You go on inside. Fire should still be going." Eleanor climbed down before he could offer help, managing the awkward height with surprising grace. She stood for a moment looking at the house, one hand absently smoothing her skirts, then walked to the door and went inside. Caleb shouldered her trunk again and followed. The house was warm, at least. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it had held. The kitchen was exactly as he'd left it, clean, sparse, functional. A table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves with basic supplies, a dry sink under the window. Nothing extra, nothing decorative. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, slowly turning to take it all in. Her expression was unreadable. Caleb set the trunk down. "Bedrooms are through there." He gestured to a door on the right. "You can have the one on the left. It's smaller, but it gets morning sun. I'm in the one on the right." She nodded, still looking around. "Parlor's through there." He pointed to another door. "Not much to it. I don't use it often." "I see." The silence stretched. Caleb shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how close the quarters were, how small the space seemed with another person in it. For 3 years he'd had the house to himself. Now there was this woman, this stranger, and she was going to be here, living here, occupying space and making sounds and just being present. The reality of it hit him all at once. "You should get settled," he said abruptly. "I need to check the stock. Dinner's at 6. "Nothing fancy. I'll put together something simple." "I can cook, Mr. Hart. Tonight I'll handle it. Tomorrow we can work out a routine." He needed to get out of the house, needed space to think. "There's water in the kettle if you want tea. Help yourself to whatever you need." He turned toward the door. "Mr. Hart?" Her voice stopped him. He looked back. She was watching him with those clear gray eyes, and for a moment her careful composure slipped. What he saw beneath it was uncertainty, vulnerability, the same fear he was feeling, reflected back. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a chance." Caleb nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and went out into the cold. The barn was a refuge. Caleb spent an hour checking the horses, though they needed barely 10 minutes of actual attention. He mucked stalls that didn't need mucking, rearranged tack that was already organized, checked feed stores he'd inventoried 2 days ago, anything to delay going back to the house. The problem wasn't Eleanor specifically. The problem was what she represented. Change. Disruption to the careful equilibrium he'd built. For 3 years, he'd existed in a kind of stasis, working, sleeping, working again. No complications, no expectations beyond his own, no one to disappoint or be disappointed by. Now there was someone in his house who expected what? He didn't even know. The contract had seemed clear enough in writing. Partnership, practicality, no romantic entanglements. But words on paper were different from reality, and reality was a refined Eastern woman standing in his rough kitchen looking like she belonged in a completely different world. A sound made him look up. Through the barn's open door, he could see the house. Smoke still rose from the chimney, but now there was light in the kitchen window. As he watched, a figure moved past. Eleanor, doing something he couldn't make out from this distance. She was real. She was here. And in a few hours, he'd have to go back in there and figure out how to share space with someone who unsettled him in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. A horse whinnied in the next stall. Caleb's mare, a sturdy bay named Willow. He moved to her stall and ran a hand down her neck. She leaned into the touch, warm and solid and uncomplicated. "We've got company," he told her. "You'll meet her tomorrow, probably. Try to be more welcoming than I was." Willow snorted. "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "I know." When he finally made himself return to the house, the sun was starting to set and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The storm he'd predicted was definitely coming. He could smell it in the air, that particular metallic scent that meant heavy snow before morning. He stamped the snow off his boots on the porch and went inside. The kitchen had been transformed. Not dramatically, it was still the same small plain room, but there were subtle differences. The table had been wiped down and reset with plates and cups he recognized from his own cupboards. A pot simmered on the stove, sending out smells of meat and vegetables. The clutter he'd gotten used to ignoring, mail stacked on the counter, tools he'd meant to put away, had been organized into neat piles. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring the pot. She'd removed her traveling dress and wore something simpler now, dark blue wool with a white collar. Her hair was still pinned up, but a few strands had escaped to curl at her neck. She looked up when he entered. "I hope you don't mind. I found ingredients for a stew. It seemed like a practical first meal." Caleb hung his coat on the peg by the door. "I said I'd handle dinner. You also said we'd work out a routine tomorrow. I thought I'd start demonstrating my capabilities now rather than later." She ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. "Please, sit." He sat because refusing seemed churlish. The stew smelled good, better than anything he'd made in recent memory. Real vegetables, properly seasoned. Meat that had been seared before stewing, giving it a depth of flavor his usual thrown-together meals never achieved. Eleanor sat across from him, her movements precise and controlled. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him expectantly. "Right. Grace." He'd forgotten about that. Sarah used to insist on it. "You go ahead," he said. "I'm not much for formalities." "As you prefer." She picked up her spoon and began eating, her posture perfect even in this simple act. Caleb ate too. The stew was as good as it smelled. Maybe better. He could taste individual spices, things he had in the cupboard but never thought to use. Thyme, maybe. Bay leaf. Something else he couldn't identify, but that made the whole thing come together in a way that made his usual meals seem like bland fuel by comparison. "This is good," he said after a few minutes. "Thank you." "Better than good, actually. Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "The same place I learned everything else." A slight edge to her voice. "My father's household. He expected excellence in all things, including meals. I spent considerable time with our cook, learning technique." "I thought you said you had servants." "I did, but my father believed women should understand domestic arts, even if they didn't practice them regularly. He wanted me to be able to oversee staff competently. So I learned." She took another spoonful of stew. "Turned out I enjoyed the actual doing more than the overseeing." Caleb filed that information away with everything else he was learning about her. Refined background, controlling father. Knowledge without freedom to use it. A life that had been comfortable but constraining. Not so different from being trapped, really. Just a prettier cage. "Well," he said, "you won't have any staff to oversee here, just yourself." Perfect. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. The first snowflakes were starting to fall. Caleb could see them swirling past the glass. "Storm's here," he observed. Eleanor glanced toward the window. "Will it be severe?" "Probably. February storms usually are. We'll be snowed in for a day or two at least." He watched for signs of alarm, found none. She simply nodded and continued eating. "That doesn't bother you?" he asked. "Being trapped inside with a stranger?" She looked at him directly. "Mr. Hart, I agreed to marry you sight unseen and travel 1,800 miles to live in isolation on a Montana ranch. Being snowed in for a few days is hardly the most daunting aspect of this arrangement." "Fair point, again." Caleb finished his stew and stood to clear his bowl. Eleanor rose too, reaching for his dishes. "I can clean up," he said. "So can I, and I'd prefer to. I need to learn where things go." She was right, though it felt strange to stand there watching her work in his kitchen. Sarah used to do this, clear dishes, heat water for washing, move through the space with familiar efficiency. But Sarah had been small and quick, her movements bird-like. Eleanor was taller, her gestures more measured. The kitchen looked different with her in it, felt different. "I'll show you the rest of the house," Caleb said, needing something to do. "You should know where everything is before the storm hits full force." She dried her hands on a towel and followed him into the parlor. It was the least used room in the house, a small space with a fireplace, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that held more dust than books. A rug that had seen better days covered most of the plank floor. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of his parents. "Not much to see," Caleb admitted. Eleanor walked slowly around the room, taking in details. She paused at the bookshelf, running a finger along the spines. "You have some good titles here. Twain, Thoreau, some agricultural texts." Sarah liked to read. "I kept her books." "Sarah was your wife?" It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "Yes." "I'm sorry for your loss." "It was 3 years ago." "Grief doesn't follow a timeline, Mr. Hart." Something in her voice made him look at her more closely. She was still studying the bookshelf, but her expression had softened. There was understanding there, personal knowledge of loss. "You've lost someone," he said. "My mother, 10 years ago. My father never recovered. Neither did I, really." She turned to face him. "Loss changes the shape of the world, makes it harder to trust that anything good will last." Caleb had nothing to say to that. It was too accurate, too close to thoughts he'd had in the darkest parts of those 3 years. He cleared his throat. "Bedrooms are this way." The 2 bedrooms opened off a short hallway. Caleb pushed open the door to the smaller one on the left. "This is yours. It's not large, but it's got good light in the morning. There's a bureau for your things and a wardrobe. Mattress is decent. I replaced it last year." Eleanor stepped inside. The room was indeed small, just enough space for a narrow bed, a bureau, and a wardrobe. A single window looked out toward the mountains. The walls were bare and the floor was plain wood, but everything was clean. "It's perfect," she said. "It's small." "I don't need much space, Mr. Hart, and I like windows." She walked to the glass and looked out at the falling snow. "I like being able to see the horizon." There was something wistful in her voice. Caleb wondered what her room had been like in Philadelphia. Probably much larger, probably filled with furniture and decorations, probably without any real privacy, if servants were constantly coming and going. Maybe that's what she was running from. Not discomfort, but suffocation. "I'll let you get settled," he said. "There's extra blankets in the wardrobe if you need them. Gets cold at night." "Thank you." He retreated to his own room and closed the door. Through the wall he could hear the sounds of Eleanor unpacking, the soft thud of the trunk lid opening, the slide of drawers, the rustle of fabric. Normal sounds that hadn't been in this house for 3 years. Caleb sat on his bed and pulled off his boots. Outside, the storm was building in earnest now. Snow driving horizontal across the window, wind howling around the eaves, the kind of storm that could kill a man if he was caught out in it. But inside there was warmth and light and the smell of good cooking. And in the next room, there was a woman who'd traveled halfway across the continent seeking escape, just like him. They were strangers bound by a contract in proximity and mutual desperation. It wasn't a foundation for anything lasting. Caleb knew that. But for tonight, it was enough to listen to those small sounds of inhabitation and know he wasn't alone anymore. Even if he had no idea what came next, even if the woman in the next room scared him more than any Montana storm. The wind screamed, the house held, and somewhere between waking and sleep, Caleb heard Eleanor moving through the kitchen, stoking the fire so it would last through the night, taking care of things, taking her place, making the first small choice that would change everything. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first morning, Caleb woke to a world buried in white. Snow had drifted against the north side of the house until it reached halfway up the windows. The barn was barely visible through the curtain of still falling flakes. He dressed quickly in the cold bedroom and emerged to find Eleanor already in the kitchen, the stove radiating heat, coffee brewing in the pot. She looked up from the pan where she was frying eggs. "Good morning. I hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't." He moved to the window, calculating. "I need to get to the barn. Stock needs tending." "In this?" She glanced toward the window where snow was still falling heavily. "They need water and feed regardless of weather. I'll rope myself to the porch. Standard practice in storms like this." He reached for his heavy coat. "I'll be back in an hour or so." "I'll keep breakfast warm." He nodded and went out into the white fury. The cold hit like a fist. Wind drove snow into his face hard enough to sting. He tied one end of a rope to the porch railing and the other around his waist, then started toward the barn, following the line of fence posts he could barely see through the whiteout. Each step was an effort. The snow had drifted deep in places, shallow in others, making the footing treacherous. By the time he reached the barn, his face was numb and ice had formed in his beard. But inside, the animals were safe. The horses whickered greetings. The cattle in the shelter shed beyond were huddled but secure. He worked methodically, breaking ice on water troughs, distributing feed, checking each animal for signs of distress. The work took longer than an hour. By the time he followed the rope back to the house, his hands were clumsy with cold despite his gloves, and exhaustion dragged at his limbs. Eleanor opened the door before he could reach for the handle. "Come in, quickly." He stumbled inside and she shut the door behind him, then immediately began helping him out of his ice-crusted coat. Her hands were efficient, working at frozen buttons and buckles. "Your face," she said, and there was concern in her voice. "You're frost-burned." "It'll pass." His words came thick. His jaw didn't want to work properly. "Sit." She guided him to a chair near the stove. "Don't touch your face yet. The warming needs to be gradual." She brought a basin of lukewarm water and a cloth, then gently began dabbing at his cheeks and forehead. The sensation as feeling returned was somewhere between burning and itching. Caleb gritted his teeth. "You do this often?" Eleanor asked quietly, still working with careful precision. "Every winter. Sometimes multiple times a day if the storm's bad enough." "It seems extraordinarily dangerous." "It is. But cattle don't care about danger. They care about water and feed." She rinsed the cloth and applied it again. Her touch was clinical but not unkind. "When will the storm break?" "Day or two, probably. Maybe longer. February storms are unpredictable." "Then you'll have to do this again tomorrow." "And the day after, if needed." Eleanor sat back, studying his face. The frostburn was visible now as red patches across his cheekbones and nose. "There must be a better system." "If there is, I haven't found it. This is the frontier, Miss Whitlock. Everything out here is designed to kill you if you're not careful. Weather, animals, isolation, accidents. You manage the risks as best you can, but you can't eliminate them." "I see." She stood and moved to the stove where she'd kept his breakfast warming. Eggs, bacon, biscuits that smelled like they'd been made from scratch. She set the plate in front of him along with fresh coffee. "Then I suppose I'll need to learn to manage those risks as well." Caleb looked up at her, surprised. "You planning to tend stock in blizzards?" "I'm planning to be useful, Mr. Hart. If that means learning to manage in dangerous weather, so be it." She poured her own coffee and sat across from him. "You said yesterday that there's no one to delegate to here. That means if something happens to you, I need to be capable of handling things myself, so teach me." He ate slowly, thinking. She was right, of course. If he broke a leg or got sick or had any one of a dozen accidents that were common on isolated ranches, She'd need to know how to keep things running, but the thought of teaching this refined Eastern woman to rope herself to a porch and wade through waist-deep snow to feed cattle struck him as almost absurd. "It's brutal work," he said. "I didn't come here expecting comfort. You could freeze to death 10 feet from the house, and I'd never find you until the storm cleared. Then you'll teach me to use the rope system properly." Caleb studied her across the table. Her jaw was set in a way that suggested arguing would be pointless, and underneath the determination, he recognized something he understood intimately: the need to feel capable, useful, not dependent on someone else's competence for survival. "All right," he said. "When the storm breaks, I'll show you the systems: how to tend the stock, manage the barn, handle emergencies. But you follow my lead exactly. No improvising, no assuming you know better. Out here, mistakes kill. Understood?" "Understood." They finished breakfast in silence. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to pile against the house. Inside, warmth and coffee and the small beginning of something that might eventually become trust. The second day of the storm followed the same pattern. Caleb fought his way to the barn twice, once in the morning, once in the evening. Eleanor had warm food waiting each time he returned, and she'd taken to heating water so he could thaw his hands gradually without the agony of plunging them straight into warmth. Between his trips outside, they occupied the small house together, navigating around each other with the careful politeness of strangers. Eleanor cleaned, organized, and cooked. Caleb mended tack, sharpened tools, and tried not to notice how her presence changed everything. She hummed sometimes while she worked. Not loudly, just soft melodic sounds that filled the silence he'd grown accustomed to. She moved through the kitchen with increasing familiarity, learning where he kept things, establishing her own systems. And she read in the evenings, curled in one of the parlor chairs with a book from Sarah's collection, firelight playing across her face. It was domestic, almost peaceful, and it unsettled Caleb more than he wanted to admit. On the third morning, he woke to silence. Not the absence of sound, the wind still blew, though gentler now, but the absence of that particular howling fury that characterized a full blizzard. He went to the window and saw that the snow had stopped. The sky was lightening to the east, promising clear weather. In the kitchen, Eleanor was already working on breakfast. She'd become comfortable with the routine, moving through the space like she'd been doing it for years rather than days. "Storm's breaking," Caleb said. "I noticed. Does that mean you can actually show me the ranch today instead of just fighting your way to the barn and back? If you're up for it, it'll mean a lot of walking in deep snow." "I have boots and warm clothes, Mr. Hart. I'll manage." After breakfast, they bundled up and ventured outside together. The world had been transformed into something almost alien. Shapes buried under snow, familiar landmarks obscured, everything reduced to white and shadow, and the brilliant blue of clearing sky. Caleb led the way to the barn, breaking trail. Eleanor followed in his footsteps, saying nothing but keeping pace. Inside the barn, he introduced her to each animal, explaining their temperaments and needs. "This is Willow, my primary riding horse. She's steady, but she doesn't like loud noises." He ran a hand down the mare's neck. "This is Banner. He's strong but stubborn. Good for heavy hauling if you can convince him to cooperate. And that's Sage. She's old, but she's got more sense than most horses I've known. If you're ever unsure about weather or danger, watch her. She'll know before you do." Eleanor moved from stall to stall, studying each horse carefully. When she reached Sage, she extended her hand slowly, letting the older mare sniff her before attempting to touch. The horse accepted the contact, and Eleanor stroked her nose with surprising confidence. "You've handled horses before," Caleb observed. "My father kept a stable. I wasn't allowed to ride. He thought it unladylike, but I spent time with the horses anyway. The grooms tolerated my presence as long as I stayed out of the way." She smiled slightly. "I learned by watching." "Can you ride?" "I taught myself in secret. Not well, I'm sure, by your standards, but I know the basics." Caleb filed that away as another small revelation. Eleanor's past was emerging in pieces. A life of capability constrained by propriety, knowledge acquired despite discouragement. No wonder she'd fled. He showed her the feed system, the water setup, the way he rationed supplies to last through the winter. Eleanor asked intelligent questions, taking mental notes. When they moved on to the cattle shelter, she didn't flinch at the smell or the mud, just studied the animals with the same careful attention she'd given everything else. "How many head?" she asked. 43 right now. I'll lose a few to weather or predators before spring, probably. That's normal. And in the spring? Calving season. If we're lucky, we'll add 20 or so to the herd. If we're not, he shrugged. Nature takes its share. Eleanor nodded slowly, processing the brutal mathematics of frontier ranching. What can I do to help when the time comes? Calving, you'll be up all night most nights, checking on the cows. Some will need help birthing. It's messy and difficult, and sometimes, despite everything you do, you lose both the cow and the calf. I'm not squeamish, Mr. Hart. I'm not worried about squeamish. I'm worried about heartbreak. It's hard to watch something die when you've been fighting for hours to save it. Something shifted in her expression. Yes, she said quietly. I imagine it is. They stood together in the shelter, surrounded by the warm bulk of cattle and the smell of hay and manure. Snow drifted through gaps in the walls. The wind had died to almost nothing. My wife died in childbirth, Caleb heard himself say. Her and the baby both. I couldn't save either of them. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. I'm sorry, that must have been unbearable. It was 3 years ago. You said that before, as if the time makes it hurt less. Doesn't it? In my experience, time just teaches you how to carry the weight more efficiently. The hurt doesn't get smaller. You just get stronger at bearing it. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her. She stood in a cattle shelter in a borrowed coat too large for her frame, her refined features incongruous with the rough surroundings, and she was the first person in 3 years who'd described grief in a way that actually made sense to him. Yeah, he said. That's exactly right. They walked back to the house as the sun broke fully through the clouds, turning the snow-covered landscape into something painfully bright. At the porch steps, Eleanor paused. Thank you for showing me everything, for trusting me with the knowledge. You asked to learn. I'm just teaching. It's more than that, though. She met his eyes. You're letting me into your life, your real life, not just the surface arrangement. That takes a kind of courage I don't think you give yourself credit for. Before he could respond, she went inside. Caleb stood on the porch, staring at the mountains in the distance. Courage. He'd never thought of it that way. Letting Eleanor see the ranch, the work, the brutal reality of what life here demanded. That had just seemed practical. Necessary. But maybe she was right. Maybe letting anyone see the truth of your life, especially when that life was built around grief and isolation, required a different kind of bravery than facing down a blizzard. The days after the storm settled into a pattern. Caleb taught and Eleanor learned. He showed her how to harness horses, muck stalls properly, recognize signs of illness in cattle. She absorbed everything with focused intensity, asking questions when she didn't understand, but mostly just watching and remembering. She was capable, more than capable. Within a week, she was handling morning chores by herself while Caleb worked on winter repairs. She managed the chickens without complaint, hauled water without being asked, and kept the house warm and the meals consistent. But it was in the evenings that things shifted in ways Caleb hadn't anticipated. After dinner, while he worked on tack or tools by lamplight, Eleanor would sit nearby with her sewing or reading. And she'd talk. Not constantly, not intrusively, just talk. About books she'd read, about things she'd observed during the day, about nothing in particular and everything at once. At first, Caleb had responded in monosyllables, uncomfortable with the intimacy of conversation, but Eleanor didn't seem to need much response. She just filled the silence with her voice, and gradually he found himself listening, then occasionally responding, then, to his surprise, initiating exchanges himself. You never talk about Philadelphia, he said one evening, 3 weeks into her residence. Eleanor looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of his, he noticed, that had been missing a button for months. What would you like to know? Why you really left? You said you were desperate to escape, but you haven't said what you were escaping from. She set down her sewing carefully. Outside, a late winter wind rattled the windows. Inside, the fire crackled and shadows played across the walls. My father is a prominent banker, she said finally. Wealthy, respected, ruthlessly ambitious. After my mother died, he became controlling. He managed every aspect of my life, what I wore, who I spoke to, how I spent my time. He said it was to protect me, to ensure I made an appropriate match. But really, it was about maintaining his image. I was a reflection of him, nothing more. And marriage was your escape. Marriage to a man of his choosing, you mean? He had candidates, suitable men, men who would increase his influence or secure business advantages. I was expected to choose from among them. Her hands twisted in her lap. I refused. So he threatened to commit me to an asylum for nervous disorders. Caleb stared at her. He couldn't do that. He's a very powerful man, Mr. Hart. He has doctor friends who would sign whatever papers he asked them to sign. I would have disappeared into an institution and no one would have questioned it. Women are committed for less than disobedience every day. The casual way she said it, the resignation to such a monstrous threat, made Caleb's jaw clench. So you ran. I saw an advertisement for the matrimonial agency. I corresponded with them in secret, arranged everything without his knowledge, and left in the middle of the night with only what I could carry. He'll be looking for me, I imagine. But he won't think to look in Montana. He doesn't believe women are capable of surviving without men to manage them. You've proven him wrong. Eleanor smiled, but there was pain in it. I've proven I can cook and clean and haul water. That's hardly revolutionary competence, Mr. Hart. You're doing a lot more than that. You're surviving, adapting, learning a completely different way of life and not breaking under it. He paused. That takes strength most people don't have, regardless of gender. She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Thank you for saying that, for seeing me as something other than decoration or burden. I don't think I've ever seen you as decoration, Miss Whitlock. You're too damn competent for that. She laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. It transformed her face, made her look young and unguarded and genuinely happy. High praise from a Montana rancher. It's the truth. The moment stretched between them, comfortable in a way Caleb hadn't experienced with anyone since Sarah. Different from what he'd had with his wife, but valuable in its own right. Eleanor understood isolation because she'd been isolated despite being surrounded by people. She understood control because she'd been controlled despite appearing privileged. And she understood the desperate need to prove competence because her entire life had been spent being told she was fundamentally incapable. They were more alike than he'd realized. My turn, Eleanor said. Tell me about Sarah. Caleb tensed automatically, but Eleanor's gaze was patient, not demanding, an invitation, not an interrogation. She was good, he said slowly. Kind. She saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. She wanted children desperately. We tried for 5 years. He stared at his hands. When she finally got pregnant, we were so happy, so damn happy. And then, you don't have to finish. Labor went wrong from the start. I rode for the doctor, but by the time we got back, it was too late. She bled out. The baby never took a breath. The words came flat, factual. He'd said them before, to other people, but somehow with Eleanor they felt different, more honest. I buried them on the hill behind the house, together. I'm so sorry, Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his given name. It should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, it felt like acknowledgement, like she was seeing past the arrangement, past the contract, to the actual man underneath. Some days I wonder if I should have sold this place and left, he continued. Started over somewhere without the memories. But I couldn't. This was our dream, mine and Sarah's. Leaving felt like abandoning her all over again. So you stayed and survived. I existed. That's not the same as surviving. No, Eleanor agreed softly. It's not. They sat in silence, the weight of shared grief settling around them. Outside, the wind had picked up again, promising another storm. But inside there was warmth and light and something that felt almost like understanding. The next morning brought snow and another round of brutal weather. But this time, when Caleb roped himself to the porch, Eleanor insisted on coming with him. You said you'd teach me to handle emergencies, she reminded him. This qualifies. He wanted to argue, wanted to protect her from the dangerous work. But she was right. If anything happened to him, she needed to know how to manage. So he showed her how to tie the safety rope properly, how to move through deep snow without exhausting herself, how to recognize the signs of frostbite before it became dangerous. She followed his instructions exactly, asked questions when she needed to, and didn't complain when the wind drove snow into her face hard enough to blind. In the barn, she helped him break ice and distribute feed. Her movements were slower than his, less practiced, but she didn't quit. Even when he could see her hands shaking with cold, even when her face was red with frostburn, she kept working until the job was done. Back in the house, warming themselves by the stove, Caleb felt something shift. Eleanor wasn't just adapting. She was becoming part of the ranch, part of the rhythm and work and survival that defined life here. "You did well," he said. "I was terrified the entire time." Fear and competence aren't mutually exclusive. You were terrified and you did the work anyway. That's what matters. Eleanor wrapped her hands around a cup of hot coffee, still shivering. How do you do that day after day? How do you face that kind of danger without it breaking you? You just do, because the alternative is watching your stock die, and that's not acceptable. He paused. And because after a while the danger becomes almost comforting, predictable. You know what you're fighting: weather, hunger, cold, simple problems with simple solutions, even if the solutions are hard. Simpler than people. Much simpler than people. She smiled at that, understanding in her gray eyes. Yes, people are complicated. People expect things you can't always give. They judge and disappoint and leave. Or die when you need them most. The truth of it hung between them. They were both running from complicated grief towards simple survival, both seeking escape in a place where expectations were clear and failure was defined by measurable outcomes rather than emotional inadequacy. Maybe that's what the matrimonial contract really offered. Not companionship or romance, but mutual escape, a partnership built on shared need for simplicity in a world that had proven far too complex. And maybe, Caleb thought as Eleanor rose to start preparing dinner, that was enough. Maybe it was even more honest than the alternative. Two damaged people choosing practical survival over the risk of additional heartbreak. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, as he watched Eleanor move through his kitchen with increasing familiarity, he felt the first stirrings of something dangerous. Something that looked a lot like the beginning of actual connection. And connection, he knew from bitter experience, was just another word for vulnerability. Another opportunity for loss. He pushed the feeling down and focused on the practical, on what was real and measurable and safe. But even as he did, some part of him recognized the lie. Because Eleanor wasn't simple. She was complicated in ways that both terrified and compelled him. And the more time they spent together, the harder it became to pretend their arrangement was purely practical. The wind howled, the fire burned, and between them, something fragile and dangerous continued to grow. The mare was in trouble. Caleb had known it the moment he'd checked the barn at dusk and found Willow pacing her stall, sides heaving, eyes rolling white with distress. The foal she'd been carrying for 11 months was coming early, too early, and from the way she moved, something was badly wrong. "Eleanor!" His voice cut through the quiet house as he burst through the door. "I need you in the barn. Now!" She appeared from the bedroom, already pulling on her boots. "What's happened?" "Willow's foaling, and there's a complication. I need extra hands." They ran through the March darkness, their breath fogging in air that still carried winter's bite, despite the calendar's insistence that spring was coming. In the barn, Willow had gone down in her stall, her breathing labored, her coat dark with sweat. Caleb knelt beside her, running his hands over her distended belly. "The foal's positioned wrong. I can feel it. If we don't get it turned, we'll lose them both." Eleanor dropped to her knees on the other side of the mare without hesitation. "Tell me what to do." "Keep her calm. Talk to her. Keep her from thrashing while I try to reposition the foal." He was already rolling up his sleeves, his mind racing through everything he knew about difficult births. He'd done this before, but never with stakes this high. Willow wasn't just livestock. She was the best horse he'd ever owned, steady and smart and absolutely essential to running the ranch. Eleanor's hands moved to Willow's neck, stroking in long, soothing motions. "Easy, girl," she murmured. "We've got you. You're going to be fine." Caleb worked by feel, his arm deep inside the mare, searching for the foal's positioning. There, A leg folded back, the head turned wrong. He'd have to push the foal back slightly to get everything aligned properly. It would hurt Willow. She'd fight. Hold her steady, he warned. The mare screamed when he started the manipulation. Her body convulsed, and Eleanor threw herself across Willow's neck, using her weight to keep the horse from lurching upright. "I've got her, keep going!" Sweat ran down Caleb's face despite the cold. His shoulder burned from the awkward angle. The foal was slippery, hard to grip, and every movement risked doing more damage. But slowly, agonizingly, he felt things shift. The legs straightened, the head came around. "It's turning," he gasped. "Just a little more." Willow's scream became almost human. Eleanor was talking to her in a constant stream now, words that were half comfort and half prayer. "Stay with us, beautiful girl. Stay with us. You're so strong. You can do this." The foal slid into position. Caleb withdrew his arm, blood-streaked and shaking. "That's it. That's good. Now we wait and let her body do the work." But he'd barely gotten the words out when Willow's contractions intensified. The mare's eyes went wide and wild. Eleanor kept her position, still murmuring reassurance, her own face pale but determined. "Is it coming?" she asked. "Should be. Any minute now." The minutes stretched. Willow pushed and strained. Caleb positioned himself to assist, ready to pull if needed, but hoping the mare's instincts would be enough. Eleanor's voice never stopped, a steady anchor in the crisis. Then, in a rush of fluid and membrane, the foal emerged. It lay utterly still. "No!" Caleb's hands were already moving, clearing the newborn's nose and mouth, rubbing its small ribcage roughly to stimulate breathing. Come on, breathe!" Eleanor had released Willow and moved to help, her hands joining his in the desperate attempt to revive the foal. They worked in synchronized urgency, rubbing, clearing, willing life into the tiny body. Nothing. "Caleb!" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Not yet. Don't give up yet." He positioned the foal differently, pressed on its ribs in a rhythm he'd seen work before. Once, twice, 3 times. The foal gasped, a shuddering wet sound, then another. Its rib cage began moving on its own, shallow but steady. Its legs twitched. "There you go." Caleb sat back on his heels, relief making him dizzy. "There you go, little one." Willow, exhausted but alive, turned her head to investigate. Her nose found her foal, and she began the instinctive cleaning, her tongue rough and insistent. The foal responded with weak movements, trying to lift its head. Eleanor was crying. Caleb noticed it suddenly, tears streaming down her face, her shoulders shaking. But she was smiling too, her hands still resting on the foal's small body as if to reassure herself it was real and breathing. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it. You kept Willow calm enough for me to work. Without that—" He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. They stayed in the stall for the next hour, watching Willow bond with her foal, making sure both mother and baby were stable. The foal, a filly, dark like her mother, made her first attempts to stand, all wobbly legs and determination. Willow encouraged her with soft nickers, patient and gentle. When they finally trudged back to the house, dawn was breaking over the mountains. They were both covered in blood and birth fluids, exhausted beyond measure, but something had shifted between them, something fundamental. In the kitchen, Eleanor pumped water into the basin with hands that still trembled slightly. "I've never experienced anything like that. Birth is always intense, difficult births even more so. It's not just the birth, it's—" She paused, searching for words. "The feeling of fighting for a life and winning, of being needed for something that actually matters." Caleb understood exactly what she meant. In Philadelphia, managing servants and hosting dinners, Eleanor's competence had been decorative. Appreciated, perhaps, but not essential. Here, her steady hands and calm voice had meant the difference between life and death. "You were essential tonight," he said. "I couldn't have done it alone." She looked at him, those gray eyes bright with unshed tears and something else, something warmer. "Thank you for trusting me with something that important to you." "Willow or the work?" "Both." They cleaned up in silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. When Eleanor finally retreated to her room to change, Caleb stood at the window watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink. 2 months. Eleanor had been here 2 months. The trial period they'd agreed to was 2/3 over, and Caleb found himself dreading its end. Not because he thought she'd leave. She seemed settled, content even, in the demanding routine of ranch life, but because the end of the trial meant they'd have to make the arrangement permanent or dissolve it entirely. And permanent meant acknowledging what was growing between them, meant admitting that somewhere along the way, practical partnership had started becoming something else. The thought terrified him. 3 days after the foaling, the March blizzard hit. It came without warning, the temperature dropping 30 degrees in an hour, wind screaming down from the mountains with snow so thick Caleb couldn't see the barn from the porch. He'd experienced storms like this before, late winter squalls that were somehow worse than the deepest cold of January, but never with someone else depending on him for guidance. "We need to get to the barn and stay there," he told Eleanor as the wind began battering the house. "The animals will need constant monitoring, and we can't risk trying to go back and forth in this." Eleanor was already gathering supplies: blankets, food, water. Her movements were efficient, focused. 2 months on the ranch had taught her to think ahead, to prepare for worst-case scenarios. They made the crossing rope together, fighting wind that threatened to knock them off their feet. By the time they reached the barn, both were gasping, ice-crusted, barely able to see. But inside, the animals provided warmth, and the thick walls offered shelter from the worst of the storm. Caleb checked each stall while Eleanor organized their supplies in the tack room. Willow and her filly were safe, huddled together. The other horses were restless but unharmed. The cattle in the attached shelter were packed tight, using their combined body heat to stay warm. "How long will this last?" Eleanor asked when he joined her in the tack room. "Could be a day, could be 3. No way to know." He looked at the small space where they'd be spending however long the storm raged. "It'll be tight quarters." "I've survived worse." She was spreading blankets on the floor, creating a makeshift camp. "At least we have shelter and supplies." They settled in to wait. The storm howled around the barn, finding every gap and crack to whistle through. Caleb checked the animals every few hours, while Eleanor maintained their small refuge, keeping water heated on the tiny stove they used for warming mash, rationing their food. On the second night, as they huddled under shared blankets against the cold, Eleanor spoke into the darkness. "Tell me about when you first came here, to Montana." Caleb shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position on the hard floor. "Not much to tell. Sarah and I were married in Ohio. Neither of us had family left. We heard about homestead opportunities out west and decided to try our luck. That must have taken courage. Or foolishness. Some days I'm still not sure which." He stared at the barn's dark ceiling. "The first year was brutal. We lived in a tent while I built the house. Lost half our stock to weather and predators. Sarah got sick twice. I questioned the decision every single day." "But you stayed." "We stayed. Because despite everything, there was freedom here, space, the chance to build something that was entirely ours." His voice softened. "Sarah loved it. She loved the mountains, the sky, the sheer wildness of it. She used to say it made her feel small in a good way, like her problems couldn't follow her to a place this vast." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I understand that feeling. Philadelphia felt suffocating even though it's a huge city. All those people, all those expectations pressing in. Here, even in a blizzard trapped in a barn, I feel like I can breathe properly for the first time in years." "You don't miss it? The civilization, the culture, the comfort?" "I miss good coffee and bookshops and being warm all the time," she admitted. "But I don't miss the person I had to be there. The constant performance of acceptable femininity, the pretense that I was happy in my cage." She turned to look at him in the dimness. "Here, I can just be. Work hard, learn new skills, contribute in ways that feel real. That's worth more than any comfort civilization offered." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. He'd been so certain that Eleanor would eventually realize she'd made a mistake, that the hardship would break her refined spirit. But she wasn't breaking. She was thriving in ways he'd never anticipated. "The trial period ends in 3 weeks, he said quietly. "I know. Have you thought about what you want to do, stay or leave?" Eleanor sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Even in the darkness, he could see the determination in her posture. "I want to stay, Caleb. If you'll have me. Not because I'm desperate or have nowhere else to go, but because I choose this. This life. This place." She paused. "This partnership." "Partnership," he echoed, testing the word. "Isn't that what we've built? Two people working together, supporting each other, becoming something stronger than either of us alone?" Her voice was steady, but there was vulnerability underneath. "Or have I misunderstood what this is?" Caleb sat up too, facing her across the small space. The honest answer was complicated. Yes, they'd built a partnership, but somewhere in the daily rhythms of work and conversation, in the shared silences and the moments of crisis they'd weathered together, it had become more than that. He cared about her in ways that went beyond practical appreciation for competent help. He cared about the way she hummed while cooking, the way she spoke to the animals with genuine affection, the way she pushed herself to learn difficult skills without complaint, the way her face lit up when she mastered something new. He cared, and caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. "You haven't misunderstood," he said finally. "We have built something. I just don't know what to call it." "Does it need a name?" "Probably, if we're making it permanent." Eleanor reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. When he didn't, her hand found his in the darkness. Her fingers were cold but steady. "Then let's call it what it is. A marriage. Not the arrangement we started with, but a real partnership. Two people choosing each other despite fear and past pain and all the very good reasons we both have to protect ourselves." Caleb's breath caught. Her hand in his felt both foreign and right, like a missing piece he'd forgotten he'd lost. "Eleanor, I'm not asking for romance or declarations of love," she continued. "I know we're both too damaged for easy sentiment, but I'm asking for honesty, for us to acknowledge that this has become real, that we matter to each other." She was right. The truth was they'd crossed some invisible line weeks ago, probably during that night with Willow, maybe even before. They'd stopped being strangers bound by contract and become something messier and more meaningful. "You matter to me," Caleb said, and the admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "More than I'm comfortable with, if I'm being honest." "Why does it make you uncomfortable?" "Because everyone I've cared about has left or died. Because letting you matter means giving you the power to hurt me. And I'm not sure I'm strong enough to survive that again." Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. "I can't promise I'll never leave or die, Caleb. No one can promise that. But I can promise that I'm here now, by choice, and I intend to stay as long as I'm able. That has to be enough." Did it? Caleb wanted to believe it could be. Wanted to believe that choosing someone in the present was sufficient, that the future's uncertainty didn't invalidate the current connection. "All right," he said quietly. "Then we make it permanent. A real marriage." "Equal partners?" "Equal partners. You have as much say in decisions as I do. This is your ranch, too." He felt rather than saw her smile. "Our ranch." "Our ranch," he agreed, and something in his chest loosened, something that had been locked tight for 3 years. They sat in the darkness of the barn, hands joined while the storm raged outside and the animals shifted in their stalls. It wasn't a romantic moment by any conventional measure. They were cold and exhausted, surrounded by the smell of hay and manure, facing an uncertain future in an unforgiving landscape. But it was theirs. This moment, this choice, this fragile beginning of something neither of them had been looking for. The storm broke on the 3rd day. They emerged from the barn into blinding sunshine and a landscape transformed by deep snow. The house was still standing, the outbuildings intact. They'd survived. Life resumed its patterns, but something was different now. Caleb and Eleanor moved through their days with a new awareness of each other, a deliberate acknowledgement of their choice. Small gestures took on added meaning. A hand on the shoulder, a shared look, the way they automatically made space for each other in the narrow kitchen. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Caleb made the monthly trip to Helena for supplies. Eleanor came with him this time, her first return to town since her arrival 3 months earlier. They navigated the general store together, Eleanor consulting on household needs while Caleb handled ranch supplies. The proprietor, a weathered man named Jackson, watched them with barely concealed curiosity. "Heard you got yourself a wife, Hart. Glad to see it's working out." "It is." Caleb's hand found Eleanor's back, a subtle claim of partnership. "You'll want to make it official, I expect. Judge Harmon's in town this week if you're looking to file papers." Eleanor looked up at Caleb, a question in her eyes. They'd agreed to make the marriage real, but they hadn't discussed the legal formalities. "We should," Caleb said. "Make it proper." An hour later, they stood in Judge Harmon's small office while he witnessed their signatures on the marriage certificate. It was perfunctory, businesslike, nothing like the elaborate ceremony Eleanor would have endured in Philadelphia, or the small church wedding Caleb had shared with Sarah. But when the judge pronounced them legally married and Caleb took Eleanor's hand, it felt more binding than any ceremony could have made it. This was choice, pure and simple. Two damaged people deciding to face an uncertain future together rather than remain isolated in their separate grief. On the ride back to the ranch, Eleanor was quiet. Caleb let the silence rest, understanding that she might be processing regrets or second thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "My father will never find me now. The marriage certificate has a different name than the one he'll be searching for." Caleb hadn't thought of that angle. "You'll be Eleanor Hart in all legal records." "Yes." She looked out at the mountains, a small smile playing at her lips. "Eleanor Hart, I rather like it." "No regrets?" "About marrying you? None. About the life I left behind?" She considered. "I regret hurting him, I suppose. For all his faults, he loved me in his way, but I don't regret choosing myself over his expectations." They rode in companionable silence for a while. Then Eleanor asked, "What happens now? We're married, legally and practically. What changes?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I've never done this, built a real partnership from scratch. With Sarah, we were young and in love, and we figured it out as we went. This is different. Different how? More deliberate, I think. We're choosing each other with full awareness of our limitations and damages. That feels more honest, but also more fragile." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I think you're right. But maybe fragile isn't bad. Maybe it just means we'll handle it more carefully." Spring arrived in earnest a week later, the snow melting to reveal brown earth and the first hints of green. The cattle needed to be moved to higher pasture, fences needed mending, and the garden needed planting. The work multiplied, and Caleb was grateful for Eleanor's help in ways he hadn't anticipated. She learned to ride properly, spending hours working with Sage until she could handle the old mare with confidence. She helped repair fence lines, her hands growing calloused from the work. She planted the garden with meticulous care, organizing crops with the same precision she'd once brought to managing her father's household. And she asked questions constantly, absorbing knowledge about ranching and livestock and frontier survival with an intensity that impressed him. This wasn't someone making do until something better came along. This was someone building a life with intention. One evening in late April, as they worked together to clear an irrigation channel, Eleanor paused to wipe sweat from her forehead. "I've been thinking about the future. Our future." Caleb looked up from the shovel. "What about it?" "The ranch is sustainable for two people, but barely. One bad season could wipe us out. We should diversify. Maybe add sheep, or consider breeding horses more seriously. Willow's filly proves we have good stock." She was right. He'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't voiced it. Horse breeding takes capital. We'd need to invest in a quality stallion, build proper facilities. We have some savings from my father's household, money I took when I left. It's not a fortune, but it's something, and I'm good with numbers. I could manage the financial side while you handle the practical breeding program." Caleb stared at her, this woman who'd arrived 4 months ago looking like she belonged in a drawing room and now stood ankle-deep in mud proposing agricultural expansion with the confidence of an experienced rancher. "You're serious?" "Completely. We're equal partners, yes? That means I have just as much investment in making this ranch succeed." She met his eyes directly. "I want to build something here, Caleb. Something lasting. With you." The words hit him harder than they should have. Want. Choice. With him. After 3 years of merely existing, someone wanted to build a future alongside him. "All right," he said, "we'll look into it. Research stallions, cost it out, make a plan." Eleanor's smile was radiant. Thank you for taking me seriously. I always have. And he realized it was true. From the moment she'd stepped off that stagecoach with steel in her spine and determination in her eyes, he'd recognized her as someone formidable, someone worthy of respect, someone he could love, if he let himself. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as they worked side by side in the fading light, it felt almost inevitable. The realization that he might be falling in love with his wife came to Caleb on an ordinary Tuesday in May. They were working together to clear winter debris from the irrigation channels when Eleanor paused to study a wildflower that had pushed through the muddy bank. She stood there in her work-worn dress, mud on her boots, and her hair escaping its pins, examining the small purple bloom with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Indian paintbrush, she said, more to herself than to him. I read about these in one of Sarah's books. They're parasitic. They draw nutrients from other plants' roots. Doesn't make them any less beautiful, Caleb heard himself say. Eleanor looked up, something shifting in her expression. For a moment they simply stood there, shovels forgotten, the Montana sun warm on their shoulders and the sound of water trickling through the clean channels. Then she smiled, not the careful, controlled smile she'd arrived with, but something open and genuine and utterly unguarded. No, she agreed softly. I suppose it doesn't. The moment passed, they returned to work, but Caleb felt it lodged in his chest like a warm stone, the knowledge that somewhere between practical partnership and this moment, his feelings had transformed into something he'd sworn to avoid. He was in trouble. That night, lying in his bed on the other side of the thin wall from Eleanor's room, he listened to the small sounds of her preparing for sleep and faced the truth. He'd broken his own rules. He'd let her matter too much. And worse, he'd started imagining a future that included more than just shared labor and companionable silence. He imagined her laugh becoming a daily sound, her opinions shaping decisions, her presence making the house feel less like a shelter and more like a home. He imagined children, eventually, though the thought terrified him after what had happened to Sarah. He imagined growing old alongside someone who challenged him and respected him and chose him every single day. The wanting was almost painful in its intensity, but wanting and having were different things, and Caleb knew better than most how quickly the things you loved could be ripped away. So he did what he'd always done when emotions threatened to overwhelm practical sense. He buried the feelings deep and focused on the work. If Eleanor noticed his increased distance over the following weeks, she didn't comment. They continued their daily rhythms, working side by side, but Caleb made sure to maintain careful boundaries. No more lingering looks, no more casual touches, no more conversations that strayed into dangerous emotional territory. It was cowardice, and he knew it, but it felt safer than the alternative. June brought the breeding season, and with it, the arrival of the stallion they'd researched and saved for. Storm was a magnificent gray with a temperament that matched his name, powerful, unpredictable, requiring experienced handling. Caleb had bought him from a breeder in Billings, gambling Eleanor's savings and his own on the hope that Storm's bloodlines would produce foals worth the investment. The first time Eleanor saw the stallion, Caleb watched her face carefully for signs of fear. Storm was intimidating even to experienced horsemen, 17 hands of barely controlled energy, scarred from fights and suspicious of humans. Eleanor approached the corral slowly, her movements deliberate. Storm snorted and stamped, but she didn't flinch. He's beautiful. He's dangerous. Don't go near him without me present. I'm not foolish, Caleb. I can appreciate his power without being reckless. She studied the stallion with the same focused attention she'd given that wildflower. What's his breeding schedule? They spent the next hour discussing bloodlines and timing and which mares would be suitable matches. Eleanor had studied the breeding records Caleb kept, analyzed the finances, and developed opinions about how to maximize their investment. She spoke with authority about genetic traits and market values and long-term breeding goals. Caleb found himself simultaneously impressed and unsettled. This was the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach 4 months ago, looking like she belonged in a different world entirely. Now she was discussing horse breeding with the competence of someone who'd been doing it for years. You've been studying, he observed. I told you I wanted to build something here. That requires knowledge. She glanced at him, something challenging in her gray eyes. Does it bother you that I'm not content to just cook and clean? No, I'm just trying to reconcile who you are now with who I thought you were when you arrived. And who did you think I was? Caleb considered his answer carefully. Someone fragile, someone who'd break under the hardship and leave as soon as you had the chance. And now? Now I think you're stronger than I gave you credit for. Stronger than I am, maybe, in ways that matter. Eleanor turned to face him fully. You're not weak, Caleb. You've survived things that would have destroyed most people. You've built a life from grief and isolation, and you've made it work. That takes a different kind of strength. Survival isn't the same as living. No, she agreed. But it's a necessary first step, and maybe we're both finally ready for the second one. The words hung between them, weighted with implication. Caleb wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to explore the territory those words suggested, but fear held him back, fear of hoping, fear of disappointment, fear of the vulnerability that came with admitting how much she'd come to mean to him. So instead he said, "We should get back to work. Storm needs settling, and the fence on the north pasture still needs attention." Something flickered across Eleanor's face, disappointment, maybe, or frustration, but she simply nodded and followed him back toward the barn. The summer progressed in a pattern of work and careful distance. They managed the breeding program together, Eleanor keeping meticulous records while Caleb handled the physical demands of managing Storm and the mares. The stallion was proving his worth, several mares were confirmed in foal, and the ones that produced would hopefully carry Storm's desirable traits. But beneath the surface of successful partnership, tension was building. Caleb could feel it in the weighted silences, the moments when their hands accidentally touched and both pulled away too quickly, the way Eleanor's gaze sometimes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. They were two people circling something neither was willing to name. In late July, a letter arrived from Helena. The postmaster had held it for weeks, waiting for someone from the ranch to come to town. Caleb brought it back with the monthly supplies and handed it to Eleanor without comment. She went pale when she saw the handwriting. "It's from my father's attorney. You don't have to read it." "Yes, I do." Her hands were steady as she opened the envelope, but Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders. She read in silence, her expression carefully neutral. When she finished, she folded the letter and met his eyes. "He's found me." Caleb's stomach dropped. "What does he want?" "He's demanding I return to Philadelphia immediately. Says the marriage isn't legal because I didn't have his consent. Says he's prepared to take legal action to have it annulled and to bring me back under his guardianship." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Apparently I'm still considered his property, despite being 28 years old." "Can he do that? Legally?" "In Pennsylvania, maybe. He has influence there, judges who owe him favors. But we're in Montana territory. Different jurisdiction, different laws." She set the letter on the table. "The attorney is coming here next week to discuss the situation and encourage me to see reason." Caleb felt something fierce rise in his chest. "You're not going anywhere." "I know that, you know that. But my father—" She trailed off, staring at the letter. "He doesn't accept defeat, ever. This won't be a simple conversation. He'll try to intimidate, to threaten, to find leverage." "Let him try. This is our land, our home. You're my wife under Montana law, and he has no authority here." Eleanor looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You'd fight for me, even though this marriage started as a practical arrangement?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Caleb could give her a safe answer, something about honoring contracts and protecting what was his. Or he could tell her the truth. "This stopped being just practical the night we saved Willow's foal," he said quietly. "Maybe even before that. You're not an arrangement anymore, Eleanor. You're my partner, my wife. And no one takes that away without a fight." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "Thank you for saying that, for meaning it. I do mean it." "I know." She wiped at her eyes impatiently. "I just didn't expect. I thought we were both too damaged for this, for caring about each other beyond practical need." "We probably are. But apparently we're doing it anyway." A laugh escaped her, watery but genuine. "Apparently so." They spent the following week preparing. Caleb made sure the ranch looked prosperous and well managed. Eleanor organized household accounts and breeding records to demonstrate their financial stability. They discussed strategy late into the nights, anticipating arguments and preparing responses. Through it all, Caleb found himself watching Eleanor with new awareness. The way she moved through crisis with focused determination, the way her mind worked through problems methodically, the way she refused to be diminished by fear, even when he could see it in her eyes. She was extraordinary, and she was his to protect. The attorney arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, stepping down from a hired carriage with the careful distaste of someone confronting primitive conditions. He was tall, thin, expensively dressed, and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who expected deference. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, not acknowledging Caleb's presence, "I'm Franklin Pierce, representing your father's interests. We need to speak privately." "It's Mrs. Hart," Eleanor corrected, her voice steady. "And anything you have to say can be said in front of my husband." Pierce's lip curled slightly as he finally looked at Caleb. "This is the man you've bound yourself to? A common rancher in the middle of nowhere?" "This is my husband, yes, Caleb Hart, and this is our ranch." "Your father is prepared to be generous, Mrs. Whitlock. He understands you were confused, perhaps coerced into this ill-advised marriage. He's willing to forget this embarrassing incident if you return home immediately. He's even prepared to find you a suitable match among his business associates." "I am home," Eleanor said, "and I've already found a suitable match. I'm not returning to Philadelphia." Pierce pulled papers from his case. "Your father petitioned the Pennsylvania courts for an order of guardianship based on mental instability. He has statements from doctors attesting to your nervous condition. If you don't return voluntarily, he'll pursue legal remedies, including having this fraudulent marriage annulled." Caleb stepped forward. "Her mental state seems fine to me. She runs this ranch as competently as any man. She makes decisions, manages finances, handles crisis situations without falling apart. Whatever doctors your employer bribed can say what they want. It won't hold up against the reality of what she's built here." "And who are you to make such assessments? An uneducated frontiersman with delusions of importance?" "I'm her husband, legally married under Montana territory law, which supersedes any Pennsylvania court order, especially one based on fraudulent medical claims." Pierce's expression hardened. "Mr. Whitlock is a very powerful man. He has resources you can't imagine. If his daughter doesn't return voluntarily, he'll make your lives extremely difficult. Business loans will be called in. Suppliers will refuse to work with you. He'll destroy you financially." "He can try," Caleb said evenly, "but we don't owe any banks money. We deal with local suppliers who don't give a damn about Philadelphia politics. And this ranch has survived blizzards, droughts, and predators. We'll survive a vindictive banker, too." Eleanor moved to stand beside Caleb, a united front. "Tell my father I'm grateful for his concern, but I'm staying here. Tell him I'm happy, healthy, and building a life I actually chose. Tell him—" She paused, emotion breaking through her composure. "Tell him I hope someday he can respect my decision, but whether he does or not, I'm not coming back." Pierce studied them both for a long moment. Then he packed his papers away with sharp, angry movements. "You're making a mistake, both of you. Mr. Whitlock doesn't forget slights. This will have consequences." "I'm sure it will," Eleanor said quietly, "but some things are worth the consequences." They watched the carriage pull away, dust rising in its wake. When it disappeared from view, Eleanor's careful composure finally cracked. She turned into Caleb's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding tight while she shook with silent tears. "I'm sorry," she said against his shirt. "I should have known he wouldn't just let me go. I should have—" "You have nothing to apologize for. You made a choice. You're entitled to make choices about your own life. What if he makes good on his threats? What if he finds ways to hurt the ranch? Then we'll deal with it. Together." Caleb pulled back enough to see her face. "Eleanor, listen to me. Your father can't control you anymore. You're not in his house, under his authority. You're here, with me, in a place he has no power over. Whatever he tries, we'll face it as partners." "You really mean that?" "Every word." She searched his face, looking for doubt or hesitation, found none. Then before Caleb could process what was happening, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief, barely more than a press of lips, but it sent electricity through his entire body. When she pulled back, Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were wide. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" Caleb kissed her back. Properly this time, one hand cupping her face while the other settled at her waist. She made a small sound of surprise that became something else as she melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "We should talk about this," Eleanor said. "Probably. Figure out what it means." "Definitely." Neither of them moved. They stood in the yard, still holding each other, the Montana sun beating down and the mountains watching impassively. "I care about you," Eleanor said finally. "More than partnership, more than friendship. I didn't plan to. I thought we'd remain practical and distant and safe. But somewhere along the way you became essential to me, and I don't know how to go back to pretending you're not." Caleb's heart was hammering against his ribs. "I've been trying to keep distance between us, trying to protect myself from caring too much. But it's not working. You matter to me, Eleanor. You matter in ways that terrify me. Because of Sarah. Because everyone I've loved has left or died, and I don't think I could survive losing you too." Eleanor's hand came up to rest against his chest, over his heart. "I can't promise I'll never die, Caleb. No one can promise that. But I can promise I won't leave by choice. I can promise I'm here, committed to this life and this partnership and you. That has to be enough." It was the same promise she'd made months ago in the barn during the blizzard, but hearing it now after everything they'd been through, after watching her prove herself day after day, it meant something different, something deeper. "It's enough," he said. "It has to be." They kissed again, slower this time, exploratory, learning each other in this new context where touches meant more than practical assistance and closeness signified choice rather than proximity. When they finally went inside, the small house felt different, charged with possibility. They moved around each other in the kitchen preparing dinner with heightened awareness, every accidental brush of hands or shoulders sending sparks through the careful distance they'd maintained. After dinner, as darkness fell and lamplight painted the walls golden, Caleb reached for Eleanor's hand. "I don't know how to do this. Build something real with someone after everything that's happened. I'll probably be terrible at it." "Then we'll be terrible at it together," Eleanor said. "We can figure it out as we go." "What if I can't be what you need?" "You already are. You see me as capable when the world told me I was decorative. You trust me with real responsibility. You fight for me when I need defending, but you don't try to control me. That's more than I ever hoped for." Caleb pulled her close, tucking her head under his chin. She fit against him perfectly, like she'd been designed for this exact space. "When did this happen? When did practical arrangement become this?" "I think it started the moment we chose honesty over pretense. Everything after that was just us learning to trust what was already growing." They sat together in the lamplight, not talking, just being present with each other and this new understanding between them. Outside, night sounds filtered through the windows, crickets and distant cattle and the whisper of wind through grass. Inside there was warmth and quiet, and the beginning of something that felt almost like healing. Later, standing outside Eleanor's bedroom door, Caleb hesitated. They'd crossed one threshold, but there were others still ahead. Eleanor seemed to sense his uncertainty. "We don't have to rush anything," she said softly. "We can take our time figuring out what this becomes." "You're sure?" "I'm sure I want to build this right. With intention. With care." She kissed him gently. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eleanor." He listened to her door close, then retreated to his own room. But for the first time in 3 years, the loneliness that had defined his nights felt different. Not erased, but softened by the knowledge that on the other side of the wall was someone who chose him. Someone who'd stood beside him against threats and challenges and who planned to keep standing there. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And as Caleb drifted towards sleep, he realized something fundamental had shifted. He'd spent 3 years surviving, but with Eleanor, he was learning to live again. The difference was everything. Summer deepened into something golden and sweet. The days were long and filled with work, but the evenings belonged to discovery, learning each other in ways that went beyond the practical partnership they'd built. Caleb found himself watching for Eleanor's smile, listening for her laughter, finding excuses to be near her even when the work didn't require it. They were careful with each other, testing boundaries gradually. A hand held while walking to the barn. A kiss goodnight that lingered a bit longer each time. Conversations that stretched late into the night, mapping the landscape of each other's hopes and fears. It was Eleanor who finally breached the last careful distance between them, on a warm August night when the air smelled of hay and wildflowers. She came to Caleb's door after midnight, barefoot and hesitant, wearing her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I don't want to sleep alone anymore," she said simply. "I want to be your wife in every way that matters." Caleb's heart stuttered. "Eleanor, I know you're afraid. I'm afraid too. But I'm tired of letting fear make our choices." She stepped closer. "I love you, Caleb Hart. I didn't plan to. I didn't think I was capable of it after everything my father did to make me doubt my own heart. But I do. And I want you to know it." The words hung in the air between them, brave and vulnerable and absolutely terrifying. Caleb had spent months protecting himself from exactly this moment. But looking at Eleanor, this woman who'd traveled halfway across a continent seeking freedom and had instead found something neither of them expected, he couldn't hide anymore. "I love you too," he said, and the admission felt like breaking open. "I've been fighting it for months because loving someone means risking everything, but you're already everything, so the risk doesn't matter anymore." She crossed the remaining distance and kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful boundaries, just two people choosing each other completely, past and scars and all. That night, they became husband and wife in truth, learning each other with tenderness and patience and an intimacy neither had expected to find again. And when Eleanor finally fell asleep curled against his chest, Caleb lay awake in the darkness, feeling something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. September brought the first hints of autumn and news from town that changed everything. A letter from Philadelphia, but this time not from her father's attorney. It was from Eleanor's father himself. She read it in the kitchen while Caleb watched, trying to gauge her reaction. When she finished, she set the letter down with trembling hands. "He's dying," she said quietly. "Cancer. The doctors give him 3 months at most." She looked up at Caleb with tears in her eyes. "He wants to see me, to make peace before the end." Caleb's first instinct was protective fury. After everything he did? After trying to have you forcibly returned? After threatening us? "I know, believe me, I know." Eleanor wiped at her eyes. "But he's still my father. And I don't know if I can live with myself if I don't give him a chance to say whatever he needs to say." "You don't owe him anything." "Maybe not. But I owe myself the closure of seeing him one last time, on my terms." She reached for Caleb's hand. "Will you come with me? To Philadelphia?" The request surprised him. Caleb had never been east of the Mississippi, had no interest in cities or the kind of society Eleanor had fled, but the thought of letting her face her father alone was unbearable. "Of course I'll come." They left Montana in late September, making arrangements for a neighbor to watch the ranch and animals. The train journey east took days, carrying them through landscapes that became progressively more civilized and crowded. Caleb felt increasingly out of place as towns became cities and wilderness gave way to industry. Eleanor watched him with concern as they rolled through Chicago. "You hate this." "I don't belong here," he admitted. "Too many people, too much noise. I don't know how you survived it." "I survived by becoming someone else, someone smaller and quieter and more acceptable." She leaned against his shoulder. "That's not who I am anymore. You helped me remember who I actually was underneath all that performance." Philadelphia, when they finally reached it, was overwhelming. The press of humanity, the noise, the sheer scale of buildings and commerce, it made Caleb's skin crawl. But Eleanor navigated it with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory, though he noticed how she held his hand tighter in crowds. Her father's mansion was in a wealthy neighborhood, a massive stone structure that screamed money and power. A servant answered the door, a thin older woman who gasped when she saw Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor, we thought your father said—" "Hello, Mrs. Patterson. I've come to see him. Is he receiving visitors?" "He's very weak, miss. The illness has progressed rapidly." The servant's eyes moved to Caleb with obvious curiosity. "Should I announce you?" "No, I'll announce myself." Eleanor's grip on Caleb's hand tightened. "This is my husband, Caleb Hart. He comes with me." They were shown to a first-floor room that had been converted into a sick room. The man in the bed was a shadow of what he must have been, gaunt, gray-skinned, his breathing labored, but his eyes, when they opened and fixed on Eleanor, were still sharp with intelligence. "Eleanor." His voice was barely a whisper. "You came." "I came." She approached the bed slowly, and Caleb hung back, giving them space while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. "Your letter said you wanted to speak with me." "I've been a fool." The admission seemed to cost him. Driven by pride and the need to control, I told myself I was protecting you after your mother died, but really I was trying to keep her alive through you, making you into what I thought she would have wanted rather than letting you become who you actually are. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "You tried to have me committed. You sent lawyers to threaten my husband. You tried to destroy the life I built." "I know. And I'm sorry, truly sorry." He coughed, a wet, painful sound. "When Pierce came back and told me about your ranch, about the man you'd married, about how you spoke of your life there, I realized I'd already lost you long before you left Philadelphia. I'd lost you the moment I decided my comfort mattered more than your freedom." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "You did. This man." Her father's eyes moved to Caleb. "He treats you well?" Caleb stepped forward. "I treat her as an equal partner. She has as much say in our life as I do. She's not property or decoration. She's my wife, and I respect her." The old man studied him for a long moment. "You love her?" "More than anything." "Good." He turned back to Eleanor. "I can't undo what I've done. Can't give you back the years I stole with my controlling and my fear. But I've changed my will. Everything goes to you. The house, the investments, all of it. Use it however you see fit. Keep it, sell it, burn it to the ground. It's yours to do with as you choose." Eleanor sank into the chair beside the bed. "I don't want your money, Father. I never wanted money. I just wanted the freedom to make my own choices." "I know that now, but take it anyway. Build something with it, something that's entirely yours." He reached for her hand with trembling fingers. "And forgive me, if you can. I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." The silence stretched. Caleb could see the war in Eleanor's expression, anger and grief and a terrible aching love for the flawed man who'd shaped her life in ways both beautiful and destructive. "I forgive you," she said finally. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free of the anger, because carrying hatred for you was just another way of letting you control me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I forgive you, and I hope you find peace." Her father's eyes closed. A single tear tracked down his wasted face. "Thank you for being stronger than I ever was, for becoming someone extraordinary despite my best efforts to make you small." They stayed in Philadelphia for 2 weeks, long enough to be present when Eleanor's father passed quietly in his sleep. The funeral was an elaborate affair, attended by hundreds of business associates and society figures who'd never really known the man beneath the powerful facade. Eleanor stood through it with quiet dignity, Caleb solid beside her, and accepted condolences with grace. The reading of the will confirmed what her father had promised. Everything came to Eleanor, a fortune that made their Montana ranch holdings look modest by comparison. Lawyers and financial advisors lined up to offer guidance, but Eleanor dismissed them all with polite finality. "I'm selling everything," she told Caleb in the quiet of her childhood bedroom the night after the funeral. "The house, the investments, all of it. I want nothing tying me to this place anymore." "Are you sure?" "It's a lot of money, a lot of security." "I have security. I have a home and a husband and a life I actually chose. This money," she gestured vaguely at the opulent room around them, "it's just a tool. We can use it to make the ranch everything we've dreamed of. But the money isn't what matters." "What matters? You, us, the life we're building together." She moved into his arms. "Can we go home now? I miss Montana. I miss our little house and the mountains and the silence. I miss being Eleanor Hart instead of Eleanor Whitlock. We can leave tomorrow if you want." They left the next morning, and with every mile westward, Caleb watched Eleanor relax. The careful society mask she'd worn in Philadelphia fell away. replaced by the woman he knew, strong, capable, unafraid. By the time they crossed back into Montana territory, she was humming softly, her face pressed to the train window as she drank in the familiar landscape. The ranch, when they finally reached it, looked exactly as they'd left it. The neighbor had done good work maintaining things, and Willow's filly had grown noticeably in their absence. Eleanor practically ran to the barn to greet the horses, and Caleb followed more slowly, watching her reacquaint herself with every animal like they were old friends. "I'm home," she said to Sage, stroking the old mare's nose. "I'm really home." That night, in their bed, Eleanor had moved her things into Caleb's room before they left, and he'd welcomed it. They talked about the future. Eleanor's inheritance meant they could expand the ranch significantly, buy more land, improve facilities, invest in quality breeding stock, but they could also do more than that. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, her head resting on Caleb's chest. "There are women like me all over the East, trapped in situations they can't escape because they have no resources, no options. What if we created options for them?" "What do you mean?" "A fund for women seeking to start over. We could partner with the matrimonial agency, provide financial assistance for travel and setting up households, give women the chance I had to choose a different life." Caleb considered it. "You want to help other women escape. I want to give them tools for freedom. What they do with those tools is up to them, but at least they'd have choices." She lifted her head to look at him. "Is that something you'd support?" "Eleanor, it's your money. You can do whatever you want with it." "It's our money. We're partners, remember? I want your opinion." He pulled her closer, moved by her insistence on shared decision-making, even when she had every right to act independently. "I think it's a good idea. A great idea, actually. We help people build lives out here. We contribute to growing the territory. And if we help women find the kind of freedom you found, that's worthwhile work." They spent the following months establishing the fund and making improvements to the ranch. They bought adjacent land, expanded their breeding program, and built proper facilities for Storm and the growing herd of horses. The first mares bred to Storm produced strong, healthy foals that immediately attracted interest from other ranchers. But the real work, the work that mattered most to Eleanor, was the Women's Fund. By spring, they'd helped 5 women travel west and establish themselves in various territories. Some married, some started businesses, one joined a teaching program. Not all the stories were perfect. One woman returned east after deciding frontier life wasn't for her, but most found what they were seeking. Eleanor corresponded with each woman, offering advice and support. She became a kind of distant mentor, helping other women navigate the challenges she'd faced. And watching her throw herself into this work, Caleb saw her bloom in ways he'd never imagined. Then, in late spring, Eleanor missed her monthly cycle. She didn't tell Caleb immediately. He noticed her pallor some mornings, the way she occasionally excused herself during meals. But it was when he found her crying in the garden, her hands pressed to her still flat stomach, that he understood. "Eleanor?" He knelt beside her in the dirt. "What's wrong?" "I'm pregnant." The words came out choked. "I'm almost certain. All the signs are there, and I'm terrified." Caleb's heart seized. Images of Sarah flashed through his mind, her face during labor, the blood, the doctor's grim expression. "How long?" 2 months, I think. Maybe a bit more." She looked at him with fear naked in her eyes. "I want this baby. I want your child. But I'm so afraid, Caleb. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't?" He pulled her into his arms, holding tight while she shook. His own fear was a living thing in his chest, but he forced it down. Eleanor needed him to be strong. "We'll get through this," he said with more confidence than he felt. "We'll get the best doctor we can find. We'll be careful, and we'll face whatever comes together." "You're afraid too. I can feel it." There was no point lying. "I'm terrified. But I'm also here, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, we face it together." Eleanor pulled back enough to see his face. "Promise me something. If it comes to a choice, if the doctor has to choose between me and the baby, you'll choose me. Promise me, Caleb." The request cut him to the bone. "Eleanor, promise me. I need to know that my life matters more to you than an abstract possibility. I need to know you'll choose me." He cupped her face in his hands. "I promise. If it comes to that choice, I choose you." Always you. But it won't come to that. We'll be careful and smart, and we'll get through this together. The pregnancy progressed through summer and into fall. Eleanor remained healthy and strong, working alongside Caleb as long as the doctor permitted. They hired a midwife from Helena, an experienced woman named Margaret, who delivered hundreds of babies and lost very few mothers. She examined Eleanor regularly, pronounced everything normal, and told them both to stop borrowing trouble. "First babies take their time," Margaret said during one visit, "and Mrs. Hart is young and healthy and strong as an ox despite looking refined. Stop worrying and start preparing." They prepared. Caleb built a cradle from pine and Eleanor sewed tiny clothes. They argued good-naturedly about names and turned the spare room into a nursery. And slowly, cautiously, they began to believe that maybe this time would be different, that maybe joy could exist without tragedy following close behind. Eleanor's labor began on a cold November morning, 3 days before the baby was actually due. Caleb sent for Margaret immediately, while Eleanor calmly timed contractions and made jokes about the baby's impatience. But as the hours wore on and labor intensified, the calm gave way to pain. Eleanor labored through the afternoon and into the night, exhausting herself with each contraction. Margaret remained calm but watchful, checking progress regularly. "The baby's in a good position," she assured them. "But it's a big baby and Mrs. Hart's frame is narrow. This is going to take time and it's going to hurt. But everything looks normal." Caleb stayed by Eleanor's side through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her face, murmuring encouragement, even when she cursed him for getting her pregnant in the first place. As dawn broke on the second day of labor, Eleanor was fading, her strength nearly gone. "I can't," she gasped between contractions. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," Caleb said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. You crossed a continent alone. You built a life from nothing. You survived your father and Philadelphia society and Montana winters. You can do this." "I'm so tired." "I know, but you're almost there. Margaret says the baby's crowning. Just a little more, Eleanor. Just a little more, and you get to meet our child." She gathered herself for one final push, drawing on reserves Caleb didn't know she possessed. And then, in a rush of blood and fluid and Margaret's triumphant cry, their daughter was born. The baby's first wail filled the room. Margaret worked quickly, clearing airways and cutting the cord, then wrapped the squalling infant in a blanket and placed her on Eleanor's chest. "You have a daughter," Margaret said, beaming. "Perfect and healthy and mad as hell about being born." Eleanor cradled the baby with shaking arms, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "She's here. She's really here." Caleb stared at his daughter, unable to process the reality. Tiny fists waving, a shock of dark hair, eyes squeezed shut against the brightness. She was perfect, completely, impossibly perfect. "Eleanor," he managed, his voice breaking, "you did it. You're both here. We made it." Eleanor looked up at him with exhausted joy. "We all made it." Margaret worked to deliver the afterbirth and ensure Eleanor wasn't bleeding excessively. Everything proceeded normally, textbook even. And when she finally pronounced both mother and baby healthy, Caleb felt 3 years of grief and fear release all at once. They'd done it. Against all odds, against every reason he'd had to believe tragedy would repeat itself, they'd created new life. And everyone had survived. Over the following weeks, they learned to be parents. Neither had any real experience. Eleanor had been too controlled by her father to spend time with children, and Caleb had lost his own child before knowing parenthood. But they figured it out together, taking turns with night feedings and diaper changes and all the exhausting, beautiful chaos of new life. They named her Sarah Margaret Hart. Sarah for Caleb's first wife, Margaret for the midwife who'd brought her safely into the world. It felt right, honoring the past while building the future. Watching Eleanor with their daughter, Caleb saw the final transformation complete. This was the woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach looking like she belonged anywhere but Montana. Now she sat in a rocking chair Caleb had built, nursing their daughter while discussing breeding schedules and fund applications, completely at home in her own skin and in this life they'd created together. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, catching him staring. "That I'm grateful for all of it, for you being brave enough to leave Philadelphia, for the matrimonial agency making what seemed like a terrible mistake, for every moment that led us here." Eleanor smiled. It wasn't a mistake. I think the agency knew exactly what they were doing, matching two damaged people who needed each other in ways neither of us understood yet. You think it was intentional? I think sometimes the best matches aren't based on compatibility checklists. Sometimes they're based on seeing two people who could heal each other if they were brave enough to try. Caleb moved to sit beside her, watching his daughter's tiny hand curl around Eleanor's finger. We were brave. Eventually, after a lot of fear and avoidance, Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. But we got there. Spring came again, their second spring together, but their first as a complete family. The ranch thrived. Storm's offspring were gaining a reputation for quality, and they'd had inquiries from as far away as Colorado. The Women's Fund was supporting its 12th beneficiary, and Sarah was growing, learning to smile and grasp and recognize her parents. On a warm May afternoon, Caleb found Eleanor sitting on the porch, Sarah sleeping in her arms, watching the mountains turn gold in the evening light. He settled beside them, and Eleanor leaned into him automatically. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving the comfort you had in Philadelphia? Your father's money could have given you an easy life." Eleanor laughed softly. "Easy isn't the same as good, and comfort isn't the same as freedom." She looked up at him. "I have exactly what I wanted. A life I chose, work that matters, partnership with someone who sees me as an equal, a daughter I'll raise to know her own worth and her own mind. It's not easy. No, it's hard, and sometimes it's scary, and I'm constantly exhausted. But it's mine, ours, and that makes all the difference." Caleb kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair and the baby and the pine-scented wind off the mountains. This was home. Not the building behind them or the land stretching around them, but this, Eleanor and Sarah and the life they'd built from grief and desperation and unexpected love. "The woman I thought was too much," he said quietly, "turned out to be exactly enough." Eleanor smiled, "And the man I thought would settle for practical turned out to have room for so much more." As the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, they sat together in peaceful silence. Two people who'd come to the frontier seeking escape had instead found purpose, found partnership, found a kind of love neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed. The ranch would continue to grow. The fund would help more women find freedom. Sarah would grow up strong and independent, raised by parents who understood the value of choice. There would be challenges ahead. There always were on the frontier. More winters to survive, more crises to weather, more grief to navigate as life unfolded in all its unpredictable complexity. But they would face it all together, these two wounded souls who'd proven that strength and refinement could coexist, that love could bloom in the harshest conditions, and that the bravest choice wasn't survival alone. It was choosing to live fully, side by side, with no distance left between them. The mountains stood eternal. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. And in the gathering darkness, a family sat together on their porch, home at last in every way that mattered.